tune in. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the OEC today for Moving the Line Redistricting in Ohio and across the United States. My name is Chris Tavner. I'm General Counsel at the Ohio Environmental Council, and I'm joined today by Peter Miller from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Peter will be speaking for the majority of this conversation, but I'll be getting us started with some introductory content before I kick it over to Peter, but Peter can kind of wave from his screen. You should all be able to see him. But yes, so this is our second Law Center webinar for the year at the Ohio Environmental Council. Last May, we did a webinar on House Bill 15, the new energy policy that passed in Ohio and all its implications for energy policy in Ohio. And so this month, this quarter, we're doing a webinar on redistricting. If you are here for CLE credit as an attorney, please make sure that you participate in the survey polls that will occur throughout the webinar to ensure that we can track your participation. And then also we'll have a survey at the end for the final survey that we need to do to get you your CLE credit. But anyone who's attending, feel free to participate in the polls and participate in the survey as well. We appreciate your feedback too, not just the attorneys. For those of you who are maybe joining one of our webinars for the first time at the Ohio Environmental Council, we're pursuing a clean, healthy Ohio where our democracy empowers all communities to thrive in harmony with the environment. And we do that by protecting the environment and health of all Ohio communities through legal and policy advocacy, decision maker accountability, and civic engagement. And so today we are talking about redistricting in Ohio, which feels like a little bit of deja vu for many of us probably. And I think, Jessica, if you can put the first poll prompt, the first polling question, I want to kind of gauge the knowledge levels of folks who are participating in this session on how much they know about Ohio's redistricting process. I was pretty heavily involved in some of the redistricting work back in 2021 and 2022, and some other folks on here maybe as well, but others maybe this is their first time hearing about Ohio's redistricting process. So it'd be great to know what knowledge level people are bringing to the table. But I will be starting with giving us a very brief overview of the history of redistricting in Ohio over the past few decades, and then what the process in Ohio is going to be over the next few months for the redistricting of our congressional maps. And then after I give that overview, I'll be pitching it over to Peter, who's going to give us a really excellent presentation on the state of redistricting at the national level and all of the various dynamics that are going on right now and how that relates to Ohio's circumstance. I think we can probably go ahead and end the panel. Are we able to see the results, Jessica? I think there's a way for you to show the results. Yes. Okay, great. So we have one person who feels like they have pretty decent knowledge. And a few folks kind of in the middle, and then some folks who this may be their first time really learning about this. Great. So a brief history of redistricting in Ohio. This is like the highest level snapshot we can give of redistricting in Ohio over the past 2 decades. So back in 2011, there was a new map drawn that was considered gerrymandered by many, and this is kind of the start of many of the gerrymandering redistricting conversations in Ohio and kind of the past decade and a half, where the Ohio Supreme Court declined to make a ruling that it was gerrymandering based on the way that constitutional provisions were written at the time. And so in the mid-2010s, we had constitutional amendments in 2015 and 2018 that were General Assembly initiated, but very much pushed for by Ohio residents and voters to change how redistricting was done. And those 2 amendments created the system that we currently have today, where you have this combination of a legislative initiated maps. The Ohio Redistricting Commission comes into play in certain steps, and there needs to be bipartisan support for the maps. And if there's not bipartisan support, then various rules kick in. It's a very complicated matrix of a process that was designed to try to get us constitutionally valid, non-gerrymandered maps. But then in 2021, as the process was tested for the first time, we saw the Ohio Redistricting Commission and the Ohio General Assembly create maps that were ultimately ruled unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court and found to be gerrymandered by the Ohio Supreme Court in 2022. Then after those Supreme Court rulings, because of the procedures that played back and forth, bouncing the maps from the court to the legislature and the commission, gerrymandered maps that were found gerrymandered by the Ohio Supreme Court ultimately turned out to be the maps that we voted under in the 2022 election. And then when a new Ohio Supreme Court, a change in the justices and who the justices were, resulted in the Supreme Court dismissing the cases in 2023. After that, the Citizens Not Politicians ballot measure was proposed an independent redistricting commission in 2024, but that failed to pass on the November 2024 ballot. And so now we are here in 2025, where we have to create a new congressional map that is constitutionally required because the map that was passed in 2021 did not receive the requisite bipartisan support. And so that map that is passed this year will then be Ohio's congressional map through 2031. There's a complete timeline of Ohio's redistricting litigation fight with all of the steps if you want to learn more on the Brennan Center's website. It's really excellent. It focuses on the State House redistricting fight. If you want to learn more about the details. This is the super high level overview of the history over the past 15 years. There's a lot more to it, but we don't have the time to get into everything. So Ohio's constitution requires a few things for the new congressional map. There's essentially a legislative process that we must follow over the next few months. And if you are someone who wants to engage in this process, knowing these steps is really important so you don't miss the opportunity to engage. So the Ohio legislature has until September 30th to hold hearings and vote on a bipartisan map. All these kind of steps are laid out in the Article 19 of the Ohio Constitution for congressional redistricting. There's also really decent information on the Equal Districts Coalition website about these steps. But ultimately, each of these steps has different thresholds for what percentage of the vote you need for the map to pass, including 50% of the minority party, which is currently the Democratic Party. And then if it's signed into law, what a veto looks like, all of those sorts of things. But if by September 30th they don't achieve a map under these circumstances, it goes to the second step where the Ohio Redistricting Commission has until the end of that month, October, to hold hearings and vote on a bipartisan map, which it requires the minority party, which in this circumstance is the Democrats, to vote for this map, at least 4 of 7 votes, including both of the members of the minority party. The maps passed by the commission take effect immediately, but if the map fails to secure the necessary votes, it goes back to the legislature, which then the legislature has the opportunity to once again pass a map that has bipartisan support. A map passed by the legislature can be vetoed by the governor, and then it can be signed into law, and then there is a 2/3 vote to include it as an emergency clause. And then if you can't get a bipartisan map, a map can be passed with a simple majority of any set of members of the General Assembly. But if a map is passed this way, it must meet additional map criteria, which has no partisan gerrymandering, no unnecessary community splits, attempts district compactness, all of these sorts of things. But if it hits this step, it'll go to the Ohio Supreme Court if appealed by parties saying that it's gerrymandered. And if that happens, supposedly it'll follow the rulings of the Supreme Court back in 2021 and 2022. But with a new makeup of the Ohio Supreme Court, it's unclear as to how they may rule on these terms in 2025 and 2026. So that's where we are with Ohio's congressional redistricting, the very fast overview of the process. But it's very live right now. You can actually go to the Ohio General Assembly's website. If you want to create your own district plan, you can actually submit a plan right now to be considered. They'll obviously be doing their own map making too, but they are giving people the opportunity to submit maps. You can also view the maps that people have been submitting. And then there will obviously be comment opportunities to testify on the bills that are being proposed by legislatures that are actually codifying a particular map. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more about actually submitting map, giving testimony, there are opportunities that OEC will be sharing with folks about that. But that's for another conversation. What we're going to learn about now is a really excellent overview of where Ohio is fitting into the national landscape of redistricting in this current moment. So Jessica, while we're transitioning to Peter, if you can bring up the next poll question, that would be great. And And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And this question is a little bit of a trick question for folks. I can't vote, but I'm curious if anyone knows the answer to this question. I did not say the answer in my slides. Peter, I'm guessing you probably know this question, the answer to this question.
I think I do, but I don't want to ruin the surprise.
All right, we'll give it a few more seconds. Jessica, you can close the panel, the poll, not the panel. And if you can show the answers. Okay, so the legislative maps for the state house were found unconstitutional 5 times, but then the congressional maps were also found unconstitutional twice. So it was a grand total of 7 times because it was 2 separate Supreme Court cases. So the people who got 5 were right for the state house process, but you got to count the congressional maps as well. And the congressional maps are the ones that we are now having redrawn this year. All right, Peter, take it away. You're muted, Peter.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Chris. Let me see. Oh, it says my screen sharing is paused. 1 second. Let me see if that works. You should. There we go.
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. Well, thanks for that introduction, Chris. It's a delight to join everybody this afternoon to chat a little bit about redistricting and give you a sense of the lay of the land across the country, and with some comments about Ohio. I'm a senior research fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, and actually I work on redistricting as for most of my job. So now is a pretty busy time, but you know this is the world we live in. My plan is to give you just a brief introduction to the concept of redistricting, how it's changed over time, talk a little bit about a related case that may be helpful in terms of some of the social science behind redistricting by looking at racial gerrymandering in Alabama. Then I'll turn to partisan gerrymandering with a focus on past litigation in Ohio, some of the highlights from the cases that Chris had mentioned with the litigation over the state house maps in Ohio, and then turn prospective in the sense of looking at the redraw to come for the congressional map in Ohio later this year, and then some commentary on the future for reform in light of issue 1's defeat in last November. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm a student of the liberal arts colleges. So whenever I think of grand representational concepts like redistricting or democracy and that sort of stuff, we go back to the ancient Greeks. And I just love this snippet from the Mosaic, the School of Athens, where you have on the one hand Aristotle pointing upward to indicate the ideals, and Plato being much more realistic and saying, oh, no, but how does the world actually work? And I just like that dichotomy when we're talking about redistricting because of how things have changed over time, in the sense that the classical version of redistricting is to account for population shifts. And initially, this was a sort of laissez-faire, hands-off approach. States could redistrict when they wanted, if they wanted, sort of to curry the whims of whichever party was in power at the time. And there was an early Supreme Court case, Colgrove versus Green, that was a majority decision by Justice Frankfurter, basically saying that the courts have no role in policing this area of political activity. Legislatures can do what they want. Obviously, that's overturned in the 1960s, and that ushers in a dramatic reorientation in redistricting. So now districts are redrawn following the census, so they're paired to a decennial process. They follow the data that's coming from the census, and they're designed to equalize population imbalances across these districts. So this is already changing one way in which redistricting had been done, which is in the sense like sort of a voluntary ad hoc process to now a ritualized decennial process where all of the states are using their own data. the uniform set of data. And here I've just indicated a couple of the major Supreme Court cases that show that the reorientation toward population balance at the congressional level. So starting with Baker versus Carr, which directly overturns Colgrove versus Green, Westbury versus Sanders, Carter v. Daggett, and then more recently Jefferson County Commission v. Tennant, all address the aspect of population balance in one way or another, as to indicate that this is a priority for legislatures to follow as they're redrawing at least congressional districts. But then, of course, the inverse side of this coin is the prospect of gerrymandering, and it's been described in one book as the most political activity in America. The comment I always go back to is we try and compare, the majesty of American political institutions by referencing the Federalist Papers. If we actually want to know how redistricting works, read The Godfather, in the sense that it's truly an exercise in raw political power. Of course, the fierce competition between the parties is nothing new when we come to redrawing districts. The classic example here, I think, is the famous Barton Plan in the 1980s. But Texas redrawing in 2003 was a watershed event. And now, of course, Texas has redrawn their districts yet again in a mid-decade basis. In short, the Supreme Court has allowed a lot of these excessive behaviors to take place in light of the 2019 court case Rucho v. Common Cause, wherein a majority of the Supreme Court argued that political gerrymandering is a non-justiciable question. So it's beyond review of the federal courts. And so now we're sort of trying to negotiate what democracy looks like in the shadow of this decision, wherein the federal courts have taken a step back and allowed states to either step in to police this area of activity or throw their hands up in a sort of learned helplessness activity. Then, of course, when we focus on racial representation, there are different ways in which racial and ethnic minorities have been had their vote diluted over time. And two of the main ways this is done, and actually defined in a court case, Davis v. Van Diemer from the 80s, refers to packing and cracking. So in essence, you can pack a minority population into one district where they have an overwhelming majority of the vote, or you can crack a population apart so that they can't win a single district in which they reside. Both of these practices are discriminatory, and both of them have been found to violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. I've included a couple of cases here. And the general trajectory is, while the court has been responsive to these claims, there have been some efforts to push back. So, for example, Miller versus Johnson in the mid-90s finds that you can't draw a district on the basis of, predominantly on the basis of race. Here again, we see an example of the Supreme Court taking a step back from their enforcement activity in 2013 in the Shelby County v. Holder decision, wherein the Supreme Court invalidates the preclearance formula, or the pre-coverage formula for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This is declared unconstitutional, and so therefore there's some of the instruments of federal oversight into election administration are now removed. More recently, and a case I'll talk a little bit about in Alabama, Allen v. Milligan, is one example where Section 2 is actually upheld by this Supreme Court. And then, of course, this Calais decision will be an oral argument reheard in Louisiana next month that may also have implications for future enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, in essence, refers to any voter qualification to deny or abridge the right of any citizen to vote on the basis of race or color. The key Supreme Court case here is Thornburg v. Jingles in the 1980s, where it defines a three-pronged test to draw a majority-minority district. And this was applied in Alabama when the legislature drew a map after the 2020 census, which was found to violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The first prong here is numerosity for the relevant district. The census data indicated that in Alabama, any part Black, meaning anyone who reported that they were identified their race as Black, or indicated Black in addition with any other racial combination, adds up to almost 27% of the state population. Then the other prong of the Jingles test refers to racially polarized voting. And in short, this means if the relevant minority population votes one way and the white majority population votes another way, you may imagine that the minority population will never win an election. So in essence, their vote is diluted if racially polarized voting is present. We already know that the numerosity test here has been met given the census data. So one question is voting in Alabama racially polarized? We have here the results of some analyses from a team based out of Yale showing that, yes, in fact, Alabama is the voting is highly racially polarized. In fact, at some of the highest rates in the country. So this would be an argument for adopting a second Black majority congressional district. And this was exactly what the three-judge panel that heard the initial complaint in Alabama found, which is to say, the direct quote is, the Alabama needs to draw a second Black majority district or something close to it. So let me walk you through a couple of the proposals that were on the agenda in Alabama. First, here's the map that the legislature passed initially in light of the 2020 census data. You can see there is only one Black majority district, this 7th district in the southwest region of the state, just north of Mobile. And that district has about 57% Black population in the district. Only about a third of the statewide Black population, however, resides in the district. So the federal court blocked this map and sent it back to the legislature to redraw the map in light of the Jingles criteria and ordered the creation of a second majority district. Here's the map that the legislature actually passed. You can see that they did not produce a second Black majority district or something close to it. In essence, there were some cosmetic changes to the districts in the state, but the 7th district remains the only Black majority district in the state. But again, only about a third, actually less than a third of the Black statewide population resides in a Black majority district. So a federal court similarly blocked this plan. The drawing of the congressional districts in Alabama was then handed over to a special master appointed by the court. The special master then drew this map that modifies the southern tier of the state to create a second Black plurality district in the 2nd district. This is as close as they could get to 2 Black majority districts. But you can see the substantial improvement in representation in this map, whereas in before 27 to 30% of the statewide Black population was in a Black majority district. Now more than half of the state Black population is in a Black majority district. So this 2nd district forms a way in which you can buttress representational claims from an increasing share of the Black electorate within the state. And this is the map that was in place for the 2024 elections. This is just one exercise in which you can show how different district configurations can meet different representational goals. But now let me just switch gears a bit and talk a little bit about partisan gerrymandering as a sort of complement to the racial gerrymandering aspect that's also been deployed in some places. The key question we're trying to answer when we're talking about partisan gerrymandering is how we can demonstrate if a given district map benefits one party over the other. And over time, there have been a variety of measures proposed in social science literature. These refer to concepts like partisan symmetry. Does a map, say, deliver the same seats on the same basis of votes to the parties? The efficiency gap, which may relate the votes from one party compared to another party. The mean and median difference, which if we recall from our introductory statistics, if we go back to a bell curve, the mean and median under a normal distribution should be the same number. As that skews, you see a deviation between the mean and median, and we can use that to demonstrate a skew in favor of one party or the other. A more recent measure of partisan advantage is this declination measure, where you plot districts according to the votes that each party wins, and then actually measure the angle between the 2 clumps of districts based on the parties. The overview from how these measures have done in the courts is not very well. The US Supreme Court has struggled with these mathematical concepts. The efficiency gap is the thing that Chief Justice Roberts was referring to when he referred to sociological gobbledygook, for example. However, at least prior to Rucho, other federal courts were able to take these data from social science and apply them to a district map in order to make a finding about partisan gerrymandering. Since Rucho, now the federal courts are not an avenue for adjudicating these questions, but states courts have stepped in and have tried to explain or apply these measures to a given litigation point. One measure that has been proposed recently is the Freedom to Vote Act. And this is one way in which you could say measure if there is a bias in seats won by one party when we plug in statewide election results into a given plan. So in essence, we use an election that is not subject to redistricting to then learn something about how redistricting skews the representation in an election. Here I've included a snippet of the text of the Freedom to Vote Act. The short summary is if you plug in the previous two presidential and Senate elections, and that you can find an advantage of more than 7% of the districts in the state, you would then declare that a map is a partisan gerrymander. And according to the text of the Freedom to Vote Act, you can go back to a court and say, this map violates the Freedom to Vote Act and therefore should not be allowed to be used in an election. Well, in light of the 2020 census and in light of the data that has been accumulated since then, we've actually applied the Freedom to Vote Act test to every state now. And here's what this looks like. Obviously, there are some states that have at-large congressional districts, and there's not much we can do to refer to those. Those in this map, those are represented in this light blue color. If we're looking at the states that would trigger the Freedom to Vote Act presumption of partisan gerrymandering, we see 19 of the states would trigger the FTVA. And this doesn't mean that, say, all of these maps are definitively partisan gerrymanders, but you rather require the state to explain themselves and explain why they drew a map in such a manner. The other good news is that about 25 states would not trigger the partisan bias, and those are represented here in purple. But the key thing here is, of course, Ohio, as you see, is in the orange category, and the congressional maps in Ohio would violate the Freedom to Vote Act if it had been in place and enacted by Congress. So let me chat a little bit about partisan gerrymandering directly in Ohio. As Chris mentioned in the introduction, Ohio has a sort of hybrid structure where the responsibility of drawing districts is shared between the legislature and the Redistricting Commission. The first point to think of this is that while we generally think that commissions are a good idea, the commission in Ohio is not really a commission. It combines legislative leadership with statewide elected officials, all of whom have some degree of conflict of interest in terms of producing a legislative or congressional delegation that fits one's partisan outcome. And there's nothing new here in the sense that previous iterations of the Redistricting Commission in Ohio have been subject to the same conflict of interest. It's just a function of assigning statewide and legislative leaders to this task is an inferior solution to, say, the model that was adopted in other states where we would have an independent commission, or was contemplated by Issue 1 in 2024. One relevant section of the state constitution in Ohio that relates to partisan gerrymandering, and a rare example of where a state has actually defined what they mean when they say proportionality and a range of free and fair outcomes, is that the Constitution requires elections from the last 10 years to be fed into a district map in a similar fashion to what's done with the Freedom to Vote Act test, so that you can relate the performance of a map to the revealed preferences of voters in Ohio based on elections that have happened in the past. The Brennan Center did join a coalition of groups challenging the constitutionality of the legislative maps in Ohio. This was a lot of activity from our office in 2021 and 2022. And some of the findings here relate to the litigation that we engaged in and discovered in the course of that legal process. But one element to go back in time is we all remember the classic political cartoon of the original gerrymander that appeared in a Massachusetts newspaper. And there was actually something similar that was done in Ohio that I thought was historically relevant, in the sense that in the 1840s, there is the so-called Midwest menagerie, where disgruntled Whigs, here referring to the political party, got a hold of the district map that was being contemplated and created animal-like caricatures of some of these districts. And this is showing District 16 in that map, where you have a collection of counties in Ohio now resembling this sort of fantastical beast. So there's the example, the application of the so-called gerrymander, or Elbridge Gerry's salamander, to the Ohio political context even dates back to shortly after the adoption of, say, Election Day as the first Tuesday after the first Monday, or the abolition of multi-member districts in 1842. So, in essence, there's nothing new about the existence of partisan gerrymandering, whether in Ohio or in other states. I think there are two concepts that we want to keep in mind as we're thinking about what we mean by partisan gerrymandering. First is just bias, in the sense that, is a map biased? Does it advantage one party over the other? But I think a more subtle related concept is responsiveness, which is to say, does the map allow for a shift in popular sentiment to then be reflected in a different arrangement of which party has power, or the seats that each party has? We can obviously identify that the legislative plans that were proposed by the commission in Ohio were biased in favor of the Republicans, and that varies in terms of the advantage that you can see here. So the first House plan had an advantage of about 8.5 seats. The second House plan had about 3.5 seats. The third House plan had about half a seat. According to one telling of this story, you could say, oh, well, the bias has been reduced over time. The system is working. However, there's other evidence to suggest that the state house maps in Ohio were resembling what some of my colleagues, Jonathan Service and Bernard Groffman, have referred to as the stealth gerrymander, meaning a map that's perfectly reasonable by physical appearance, but actually operates as a gerrymander. In essence, the need here is not to look at superficial evaluations of, say, the visual appearance of a plan, but actually to pick it apart and see how it might work under different electoral scenarios. So let me give you an example of what I mean here. If we take the 99 state house districts in the third proposed plan from the commission and arrange them from most Democratic on the left to least Democratic on the right, you can also relate that by the share of the statewide vote that the Democratic candidates would need to win in order to win a given seat. And so here you can see this horizontal line reflects the decades worth, we had 6 years worth of elections data to suggest what the typical Democratic candidate would perform in a statewide election in Ohio. And then we relate that to these districts in the state house map. A couple of obvious elements to pay attention to is this plateau of districts between, say, about 25 and about 45% of the vote, where you have a clump of observations. And yet you don't see a corresponding plateau just above the point at which Democrats exceed their expected vote share. So let me zoom in on that aspect of the curve just to show a couple of observations about how the state house plan, this third proposed plan, was not responsive to the change in votes. So here we can see, if we focus only on the vote shares between 45 and 47% of the vote, you can see this sort of horizontal grouping of state house districts. And one point to bear in mind here is, if we take 46% as, say, the typical Democratic expected performance, there is a group of districts for whom, or for which, a small change in vote share would deliver those seats to a Republican winning candidate. However, we don't observe a corresponding group of districts on just above the 46% line. The implication being here, a subtle shift in vote shares will shift a number of Democratic seats to Republicans, but there isn't likely to be a corresponding shift in favor of Democrats if, say, the vote share shifts in favor of the Democratic candidates. This is one point that we tried to raise to the court's attention when we said that this map was not responsive. And in that regard, we were successful. So in rejecting the third maps adopted by the commission, the State Supreme Court of Ohio at the time found, and I'll quote just here, the remarkably one-sided distribution of toss-up districts is evidence of an intentionally biased map, and it leads to partisan asymmetry. Our expert, Dr. Michael Latner, opined that under likely election scenarios, the third plan performs worse than the second plan because it has a greater number of Democratic-leaning toss-up districts while containing no Republican-leaning toss-up districts. This is another way in which social science indicators can help distinguish a good district plan from a bad district plan, how it can identify partisan gerrymandering or indicate that this partisan gerrymandering is absent. Of course, a lot of these analyses we've done were at the legislative level, and I'm talking about them here today, just in part because it's a little easier to make observations when you have 99 dots to relate to each other rather than the smaller number of congressional districts. That being said, the similar type of analyses could be performed at the congressional level. It's just a question of fewer observations with larger districts. Let me now turn a little bit to prospectively to then discuss the process to redraw Ohio's congressional districts in 2025. As Chris mentioned, Ohio has a sort of hybrid process where if maps are not passed on a bipartisan basis, the maps without bipartisan support are limited to 2 election cycles. And we've reached the end of the lifespan of the map that was adopted after the 2020 census. And so now we're in a place where we have to redraw the congressional maps in Ohio following a sort of convoluted process that Chris mentioned in his introduction. One key point of this process to bear in mind, however, is that public comment hearings on the congressional plans are required by state law. And this includes both if the legislature ends up drawing the map and if the commission considers a map. So let me just chat a little bit about how you as residents of Ohio can make effective public comments in a redistricting context. And here, and I don't mean to toot my own horn, but the benefit here is I can refer to my research without needing many notes, is that I spent some of the 2010 redistricting cycle traveling the country and attending public comment hearings on redistricting precisely to then see what makes an effective comment and how the public can meaningfully engage in this process. In the 2010 cycle, our research was motivated by an interest that we wanted to know if private citizens, public officials, and group representatives can successfully suggest features to a district map. And this was laid bare for me during a hearing in Nevada, where one member of the public who was testifying in front of the special masters at the time said, and this quote just rings in my mind, you are required by law to hold hearings across the state and get public input. Does it really matter? Will you truly consider our opinions? And so our research was motivated to try and answer this question. We were interested, are courts and commissions more responsive than legislatures? Are they more likely to adopt public comments? What are the dynamics of when a comment is adopted and when is it rejected? Broadly speaking, I think there are 2 competing models for public involvement in the process. You could have a cynical approach, which is to say the public comments are a sham and they'll be ignored or manipulated to fit some preconceived conclusion. And this was an example like Florida had a statewide process to solicit public comment into their maps. Subsequent litigation, however, revealed that the public comment was more or less a sham. Insider consultants were manipulating the process and getting their message through to the map drawers while the public was being sidelined. In Virginia, there was another example of a public competition to draw the maps. This generated a lot of public interest. Alternate proposals came out, but in the end, the legislature paid no attention to any of the public comment or the maps drawn as a result of this contest and drew the map that they wanted in the first place. We could also have an idealist take on this, which is to say the hearings can be an exercise in direct democracy, in the sense someone can come and forward and say, this is what I care about in terms of representation, and here's how I would like you to implement what I'm trying to articulate. So across the 22 public comment hearings I attended or was able to get a hold of transcripts, we come up with a set of 937 discrete comments that were collected in over a period of 7 months in 2011 into 2012. Can the public actually provide meaningful information to redistricting authorities? Yes. Almost 2/3 of all the comments were feasibly mappable, in that they included a location and some sort of instruction to map drawers, which could say, here is my community, please keep it in one district, or please draw this city with another city, or separate us from this other county, we're a little different. Or a nice example may be, the folks in Long Beach, California were adamant that the port of Long Beach should be included in the same district as the city, as the port produces a lot of the pollution that the city then has to deal with. And they wanted the representative of their district to be accountable for efforts to control pollution originating in the port of Long Beach. Are the comments adopted in final maps? Yes. About 40% of the feasible comments were adopted in final maps across all of the states that we included in the study. There was a slight improvement when we compare draft maps in Arizona and California to the final maps that were adopted in those two states. Private citizens and public officials were more likely to have their suggestions accepted rather than group representatives, but we didn't find any significant difference between comments accepted by legislatures or commissions, though we do find that courts are less likely to adopt comments than either of the other institutions. And public comments that dealt with a smaller area were more likely to be adopted than comments that were much more geographically wide-ranging. Let me give you an example. So here on the right, you can see the town of Pleasanton, California in green. And you can see that under the old maps in California that were in place during the 2000s, the city of Pleasanton was split between two congressional districts, District 13 and District 11. Under the revised map that was first drawn by the Commission of California in 2010, after the 2010 census, so before the 2012 elections, Pleasanton is now entirely within District 15. And this is, I think, one example of how residents of Pleasanton can present themselves before the commission and articulate why their city should be kept in one district as a means to accomplish their representational goals. So as we're looking forward, not to the 2020 cycle here, but rather to the 2025 remedial process in Ohio, my suggestions to folks is to keep the scale of your comments small. So think neighborhoods rather than counties, as counties tend to have larger population that may be difficult to incorporate into a district plan as it's being formed. Explain why the comment is important to you. So in essence, what are the indicators that you think are important for people to bear in mind? Is that, we're united by common transportation linkages, or there's a substantial commuting population that moves between places that therefore should be in a similar district? Are there qualities of the community that are unique that either members of the commission or the legislature should be aware of, so that they know when they're drawing their maps not to divide one group from another? One element that came out of the discussions I was having with legislators, commissioners in the 2010 cycle was it was very easy to identify when people are rehearsing and repeating wholesale scripts. So there's I think an interest in making your contribution unique and not just relying on, say, reading a speech that someone else had written verbatim, but rather showing the redistricting authorities what your novel contribution is. Like, what is the element that matters to you and individually, and not so much, say, one circulated script that can then be used by a group of people to say the same thing. The difference between AstroTurf and grassroots mobilization, put a different way. So let me just chat a little bit about issue 1 in 2024. The issue 1 would have adopted a 15-member independent commission to draw congressional and legislative districts in the state. There was some public polling from Bowling Green State University that showed issue 1 had 57 to 60% support in September and October before the election. I think the contentious point here proved to be the summary describing issue 1. The ballot board summary was challenged at the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court largely left as is the summary text, which included some convoluted language about how issue 1 may require gerrymandering in some instances. I think the result is, if we look at county level voting patterns across issue 1 on the horizontal axis here and issue 1 in 2018, the previous successful redistricting reform, you can see that in the 2024 iteration to adopt an independent commission fell behind the benchmark of 2018's success across the entire state. There was no place in which the 2024 ballot measure outperformed the 2018 ballot measure. And probably more troubling is the close correlation between Democratic votes or votes in general for Sherrod Brown's Democratic Senate campaign and the issue 1 campaign. In essence, the question of redistricting became polarized by party, and it just was not a successful coalition as it was being into the end of the election cycle. So I'll just conclude with a couple of thoughts about the future for reform in Ohio. And I think it may be instructive to look at an example like California, where the adoption of California's independent commission followed after a series of failed statewide ballot measure campaigns dating back to the 1980s. And to add insult to injury, the commission in California was established in 2008, and in 2010 there was a competing ballot measure to abolish the commission and return the power to redraw districts back to the legislature. And that was thankfully defeated. And now the commission in California is, I think, safe, at least depending on or contingent on what happens in November with another ballot measure to adopt a remedial congressional map in California. It may be helpful to bear in mind the saga of what's going on with Proposition 4 in Utah. Proposition 4 was passed in 2018 to create a redistricting commission in the state. This proposition was then amended and edited by the legislature, and the legislature then proceeded to draw their own map in the absence of consultation with the redistricting commission. Both of those efforts have since and just recently been declared unconstitutional by courts in Utah, and now the legislature in Utah is also involved in a remedial process to redraw their map, which was found to violate both questions of partisan gerrymandering, but also the importance of citizen-led initiatives in the state. The Ohio experience was obviously a failed effort in November of last year, but there were previous failed efforts back to the 1980s. Similarly, in the trajectory of California. However, there are also successful measures in Ohio, in particular, the issues in 2015 and 2018 that made incremental amendments to the redistricting process in Ohio. And I think the key sort of North Star to keep your eye on here is that reform efforts, and I think generally speaking, American democracy requires and depends on a stable majority in favor of open and responsive electoral institutions. There are a variety of other states that have engaged in some aspect of redistricting reform toward a better and more inclusive and more responsive electoral practice, especially with handing off the task of redistricting to independent and neutral bodies like commissions. But there's always been a backlash that these reform efforts have inspired. And the question, and I think the longevity of American democracy, will depend on which side wins these sort of debates over representation of our institutions. I hope that one day redistricting is sort of seen as a bygone relic of the sort of gilded or golden age of American politics. We're not there yet, but I think we're on our way. And I think that the way in which the states that have these commissions are able to demonstrate the drawing of fair, responsive, and successful maps will mobilize other states to eventually, get rid of the conflict of interest practices that define a lot of how districts are drawn across the country, and as a consequence, produce responsive and open and fair electoral outcomes in the United States. So let me I'll end my prepared comments here, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to hear any questions folks may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. For folks tuning in, please feel free